Welcome back. This is Jeff Byers, and this is Module 5. This is Annie 150, Introduction to 3D Modeling and Game Art. And we are going to prep the low poly dagger and battle axe for UV mapping. Okay, this is the low poly and the high poly. So, give you an idea what you need to have. You need to have your high poly battle axe, your low poly battle axe. You need to have your high poly dagger and your low poly dagger. So I've got all that in my scene, and they need to overlap each other. Now I like to keep my pieces separated. Now if you combine these, if you went into something like this and you combined it and it looks like this, it's low poly, and what you can do is you can go in here and separate it, okay, by clicking on that. If you do that, you're going to want to make sure you delete by type history. So let's go ahead and go back into object mode up here, and you want to delete by type history, and then freeze transformations. Now the objective here is that you only UV map the low poly, and I have to say that a couple times because some of you may make a mistake and think you need to UV map the high poly. You don't. So the UV mapping happens only on the low poly in game art. Okay, the low poly is what gets the UV map. Okay, the high poly, okay, let's look at the high poly here, is going to be directly inside of the low poly. So the low poly will be just a little bit bigger, usually, than the high poly. So the low poly is always just a little bit, so it fits right in there. You can see that it fits pretty much in there inside of each other. So for that, it has to be able to bake those maps. So if I put it side by side like that, and we were to save those out, they wouldn't be occupying the same space. They have to occupy the same space for the maps to bake properly. Now what does that mean? So you see all those beautiful edges that you see in the high poly, all that little details, okay? And you see that edge there, that's considered an infinite edge. That means that it will never reflect the light. But if I bake the maps, okay, from the high poly onto the low poly, then that little edge that you see here will show up on the normal map, and it will make it look like this. So basically, if you bake maps, whatever you see here on this high poly, you'll see here on the low poly, which is pretty cool. So you see those nice soft little edges right here, okay? You'll see that on here as well if the map bakes properly, okay? So that's our hope, is to make sure the maps bake properly. So they can't bake properly unless they're occupying the exact same space. That's what I mean by that. If I talk to you or email you, or we're going back and forth with email messages, that the low poly and the high poly have to occupy the same space. Okay? Right. Since I moved it, I can't get it exactly perfect at 0, so I just typed that in. Okay? So now they're on top of each other, right? So let's say you modeled your high poly in a different scene, or your low poly. I'm hoping you modeled the dagger in the same scene, the high poly and low poly, so you don't have to. The thing is, if you do have it to the side and you have to do it by hand, then be very, very careful. You may want to go to the top view and make sure they're occupying the same space. Now, if you're not sure and they're off a little bit, what you want to do, this is a surefire way to make sure this will work, okay? So you want to take your low poly, okay? Let's say they're like this right now. You want to take your low poly, select it, and you want to center pivot, okay? Center pivot, okay? And then you want to click on the grid snap. So click on the grid snap. And what you want to do in both axes, which is your x-axis this way, you want to move it a little bit and then move it back, okay? And then you want to use in the z-axis, you want to move it a little bit and then move it back, and that will center it exactly. You want to do the same thing with this. You want to select that, and you want to click on center pivot, and you want to move that back and forth until you get right to the middle, and then you want to move that forward and back until you get into the middle, and that will make them fit perfectly over top of each other. Okay, that's a little tip I learned. Okay, all right, so again, we want to select both of those and delete by type history and freeze transformations, of course, and that will make it so they're on top of each other, right? So place them in different layers, okay, layers that make sense, okay, so the high poly should be in a layer called Dagger High Poly, okay, and you can turn that off and on, and then the low poly you should be able to turn that off and on as well, okay. Now if it doesn't, then what you need to do is select everything and either create a new layer and rename it, or you can go in here and right click over it and go to add selected objects. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that out of there. So if I click on this now and right click over it and go to delete layer, you'll see that it doesn't delete the object, which is kind of nice. Okay, it's always there, but it deleted the layer. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select the object, create a new layer, and we're going to call that Dagger Low Poly. Alright, cool. Alright, so that is in there, and we've got a high poly dagger in there, and we're all good to go. Okay. Now what I would suggest you do, that another thing that would be a good idea, is to select the object and right click over it and give it a material. So assign new material, and it really doesn't matter what material you actually give it, because we're not going to be rendering this with Arnold, the high poly. It's just used for one thing and one thing only, and that is to bake maps. Okay, we'll never really use this again. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and stick with Arnold shaders, because I think you need to kind of get used to working with those, and click on AI Standard Surface. And what I would suggest that you do, okay, we have to click on the arrows to go across, so you can click on these arrows up here, back and forth, and it should be off to the right. Okay, so here it is, AI Standard Surface, and we want to rename that something like, oh, I don't know, Dagger HIPOLY, and then underscore texture TX. Okay. Alright, so something like that. And what you want to do is the color should be not white, but it should be darker. Okay, so we want the high poly to be dark. Okay, and so let's go ahead and put that back in its layer, Control A, and just turn that off. Okay, so that's, you know, having it color coded is going to help a lot. And then the other dagger, okay, we want it to be a lighter color, so I'm going to select that. Just marquee select everything and right click over it and go to assign new material, and go to Arnold shader and go to AI Standard Surface, and we will keep it white. Okay, I'm going to rename it Dagger Low and Texture. There we go. Perfect. All right, and click off. So that's done. So I'm going to just click a little piece here in the pommel and just go Control A, get back in here, and turn that off. We're going to do the same thing for the battle axe high poly. Okay, so the high poly needs to be one piece, right? Okay, we did that in an earlier video. I think that was in module 4. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and add a material. So right click on it and go to assign new material, and click on Arnold shader and then AI Standard Surface. Here we go. And in here we're going to call that axe low, or excuse me, that's high, isn't it? High and texture. There we go. And we're going to make that color it's going to be dark again, just like the other one. That's our high poly. So click on it and go Control A, and then turn that off in the layer box. Right now we're going to go into low poly. Okay, that'll be 2 different pieces. Alright, so the low poly, we're going to go ahead and right click over it and go to assign new material, And we're going to do the same thing. AI standard surface. And this one will be white, so we don't have to change anything on there, but we will change the name. So X and low and TX. There we go. Okay, click off. So now we're all set. Right? Now, some of you are asking, well, how do I get my my scene all set up like yours? What we can do is, if you know where everything's at, you can. It's easy to do. You can, if you have a high or low poly somewhere in a scene, and you can have scenes all over the place and pull things. But what you do is you select the piece that you want to export, and you save it out, and you go File, Export Selection. So you click on that, and you want to export it as a Maya binary. You don't want to do OBJ right now or anything else or FBX. You want to do Maya binary. Okay. There's a reason for this. It's a lot more stable if you do it this way. So I'm going to export selection. Okay, go ahead and export it. You can rename it, and make sure you rename it something that means something to you. So when I'm exporting, I usually say the name of the object. Okay, it could be, you know, battle axe low poly underscore export, and then when you put the export, you know that was an exported piece. So go ahead and do that. Alright, and I'm going to cancel because I've already done this. And then let's say you open up a new scene that has your low poly dagger, let's say. So you open that up, and there's your low poly dagger, and you got a bunch of junk in here. And all you want to do is just take this low poly dagger. What you do is hold the shift key and just select all the parts, and go to File, Export Selection. Okay. So what you're doing is you're exporting all these pieces. Could be the low poly dagger, could be the high poly, and you can have them all over the place. But what you're going to do is you're exporting them out, export selection, and doing Maya binary. And when you're doing that, you're renaming them something that makes sense. Okay, right? It describes what it is, and it's going to be an export. And then when you get all that done, okay, what you do, and I've already saved this, is you go File, New Project. Okay? And then this is a brand new project. Everything's cleaned out. So all you have to do is go File, Import, and you can start importing all your cool little pieces. So let's say we have, here's my Battle Axe low poly export. So let's import that one. And there it is. Okay? That's really not the one I wanted, so let me do that again. So let's see, import, yep, and then Battle Axe, there we go. That's the one. Alright, so there it is. That's the low poly, and then what I do is while I'm in here, and sometimes the layer comes in, but if it doesn't, you can create your own layer and then turn it off. And then what you want to do is, since I have the low poly in there, I'm going to go into import. Okay. And now I'm going to do the Battle Axe high poly. Okay. And there you are. So now you have your low poly. Okay, let me turn on the wireframe on shaded so you guys can see. And then the high poly, you can tell the difference between the two. And I should be able to tell the difference too, you know, when I look at your stuff. Okay. So that's the idea. So you're slowly importing your stuff into one scene. Now don't worry if your object is like down here. Remember I showed you a tip on how to move those up and down, right? Let's say the high poly, it came in like this, right? Well, you remember what to do? It's pretty easy. What you want to do is you want to select both, you know, this one, and you want to center pivot, right? And you want to select this guy right here and center pivot. Just, oh, I need to do that again. Center pivot and center pivot. Okay, so what you're going to do now is you're going to take these two guys here, and we need to delete by type history so they move together like that. But what you want to do is you want to click on the grid snap, and you want to snap it to the grid. Okay, right? And then you want to take this guy and snap it to the grid as well. Okay? And that will get it perfectly aligned. I don't know what happened here. I think I forgot to select them both. Nope, it wants to pop in the middle. Right, so you might have to combine those temporarily, but then you can separate them again. Again, you can combine stuff together like this. It's pretty easy. And then center pivot it, right? And then you can move it. There we go. And then I click on that, center pivot that, and then move that up. And they will perfectly align. Now I've got these kind of angled weird. This one for sure. Might have to bring that back. I don't know how that happened, but there you go. Okay. So that's how you align things. And that's how you import your stuff. And you can continue doing that. They're both in just different layers. Well, this one kind of got out of that layer, but we can add it by selecting it and going to add selected objects. And I don't want them together because I'm going to be UV mapping, so I'm going to select it and then separate it like that. And that way it'll separate these two back together. Okay, separate these back the way they were. Right, so that's an easy way to clean up your scene. Again, you know, we could do the Dagger. So import, and then we'll click on the low poly Dagger export. So it's fairly easy to get everything going. Okay, there's the Dagger. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and center pivot and just move that up. And it made and it kind of messed up, so delete by type history. Delete by type history, freeze transformations. Nope. Sometimes that happens, and what you have to do is you have to put it together. So combine it and delete by type history, and then we're going to move it up. There we go. Then I can select it and separate it, and it separates all the pieces. Now when you do that though, it will take it out of your layer. Okay, so that's something to think about. Alright, so the only thing I have left to do is the other Dagger. Again, when you do combine and separate, or just combine it, it'll throw it out of the layer. Okay, if you combine it or separate it, it will throw it out of the layer, meaning it'll get it out of the layer. So you have to kind of select it again and give it a little nudge saying, oh, get back in there, and then you can turn that off. There we go. So we'll turn that off and we'll get the high poly in here. One more example here. Whoops. And high poly Dagger. Here we go. And there it is. Okay. Now if we're worried about them occupying the same space, you can do the old trick, right, that I showed you earlier, that you center pivot and then you hit and you turn on the grid snap and you move it back and forth until it situates itself. And then what you do the same thing with the other one. So let's turn that off and turn this one on. And I can center the pivot on that one. Actually, I'd have to go in here and do this. Combine it, center pivot. There we go. So that'll act like the other one. And we'll move it back and forth like that. And that's a surefire way. And then I'd separate it again. There we go. And that's a surefire way of getting it exactly in the center. They'll overlap each other perfectly. Okay. Alright, so we're good to go on that. Alright, so now you know I have the scenes all ready to go. And no worries. Now it doesn't fix the rotational problems that I'm having here. Let's see, I don't know what's wrong with this. Negative 180 maybe? Yeah, that's what it is. And let's go ahead and delete by type history and freeze transformations. And it's still up a little bit too high. Let's see here. Alright. Okay, so now what we do is we'll come to we'll go ahead and go to part 2, where we'll actually start laying out the UVs for the dagger. We'll do the dagger first since that's the easiest one, and then we'll get on to laying out the UVs for the battle axe. Alright, I'll see you guys in that video.